She was asked to play a simple tune, but her performance stunned the entire hall. Nobody in that hall that night was expecting anything special. It was a cold Tuesday evening in October, the kind of night where the rain doesn't pour, it just sits in the air and makes everything damp and gray. The Sheffield City Hall had been set up for a small community talent show. Paper tablecloths on round tables, a few strings of warm lights, a stage with one spotlight and an old black upright piano that looked like it had been sitting in that corner since before most people in the room were born. About 300 people had shown up, local families mostly, some charity workers, a few council staff, a couple of journalists who had come along because they had nothing better to cover that week. It was the kind of event where people come with low expectations and a plate of biscuits, hoping for a decent evening out. Nobody was expecting to remember this night for years to come. Backstage, a young woman named Nadia was sitting on a fold-out plastic chair, pressing her palms flat against her thighs. She was 24 years old. She had moved from Krakow, Poland to Sheffield 5 years earlier. She worked as a hospital cleaner, doing double shifts most weeks, to send money back home and pay off debts her family had left behind. She had short dark hair, a quiet way of speaking, and the kind of tired eyes that come from years of getting up at 5 in the morning and going to bed long after midnight. She almost hadn't come tonight at all. Her friend and co-worker, a warm and cheerful woman named Blessing, had signed up her cousin for the talent show months ago, but the cousin got sick that very afternoon. Nothing serious, just a bad cold, and Blessing had panicked. She had gone to the organizers and told them, a little impulsively, that her friend could fill the slot, that her friend played piano, which was true, technically. What Blessing hadn't mentioned, because Nadia had never mentioned it to her, was that Nadia had trained as a classical pianist at the Krakow Academy of Music from the age of 7. She had studied for 11 years under some of Poland's finest teachers. By the time she was 18, she had won regional competitions and been told by more than one instructor that she had a rare and serious gift. But that was another life, another version of her. When her mother passed away suddenly, the year she finished her studies, a heart attack, without warning, on an ordinary Thursday morning, something in Nadia had closed. Her mother had been her biggest supporter, the person who had saved up to pay for lessons, who had stood at the back of every recital with her coat still on, crying quietly with pride. Without her, the piano felt like it belonged to a past that hurt too much to visit. She moved to England. She put her training away like a coat she no longer wore. She kept a small, second-hand keyboard under her bed in her tiny flat, and she touched it sometimes late at night, but only for a few minutes. She never told anyone about it. At the hospital, she was just Nadia. Quiet, reliable, always brought food to share on the night shift. When Blessing found her in the staff locker room that Tuesday evening and explained what she'd done, Nadia said no. She said it calmly. She wasn't angry. She was just certain. But Blessing sat down beside her and didn't say anything dramatic or try to argue. She just looked at her and said, very quietly, "Your mum would have pushed you out that door herself. You know she would have." Nadia stared at the floor of the locker room for a long time. The fluorescent light buzzed above them. Somewhere down the corridor, a trolley wheel squeaked. She picked up her bag and said, "All right, fine." She hadn't performed in front of anyone for 6 years, and she had no idea what she was about to do. They arrived at the hall late, hurrying in from the rain. The event coordinator, a short, flustered man with a clipboard and a pen tucked behind his ear, spotted them near the side entrance and waved them over urgently. His name was Gerald. He looked like a man who had been saying 2 minutes to everyone all evening. He glanced at Nadia, handed her a small card with her name on it, and said, "You're on third. Just play something cheerful. Keep it simple. Under 3 minutes if you can. Nothing complicated. Yeah? People want to enjoy themselves." He was already walking away before she could respond. Nadia stood backstage and looked through the gap in the curtain at the old piano on the stage. The spotlight caught its surface and made it glow faintly. She watched a teenage boy finish reciting a poem to gentle, polite applause. She watched a middle-aged woman in a red cardigan sing a folk song that made some of the older people in the audience smile. Then it was her turn. Her name was announced simply, with no introduction. The radio presenter at the judges' table read it off his sheet without looking up. And now, playing piano this evening, Nadia Kowalski. There was a small, courteous round of applause, the kind you give to someone you know nothing about. She walked out onto the stage in her everyday clothes. A dark blue jumper, plain black jeans, flat shoes. She sat down at the piano bench and adjusted it slightly. She placed her hands on her lap for a moment. People in the audience were still talking softly among themselves, reaching for their drinks, checking their phones. She touched the keys without pressing them, ran her fingers along them, the way you might trail your hand along a wall you haven't touched in a long time. The piano was slightly out of tune. She noticed. She breathed through it. She closed her eyes, and then she began to play. The first few notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor came out softly, carefully, like someone walking through a door they've been afraid to open. The talking stopped, not gradually, all at once. Within the first 10 seconds, the entire hall had gone quiet, in a way that rooms almost never go quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience being well-behaved. Something deeper than that. The kind of quiet that happens when something real is in the room, and everybody feels it at the same time, even if they couldn't explain why. The music grew. It moved from something gentle and searching into something that had weight and urgency behind it. Nadia's posture changed as she played. Her shoulders dropped. Her face, which had been tense and still when she walked on stage, began to move with the music. Her eyes stayed closed. She wasn't performing anymore. Not in the way that word usually means. She wasn't trying to impress anyone or hit the right notes for the judges. She was somewhere else entirely. She was in the flat where she grew up, where her mother used to hum while cooking, and stop whatever she was doing to come and listen whenever Nadia played. She was at her mother's funeral, sitting in the front row, and not being able to cry. She was on the plane to England, looking out the window at clouds, and trying not to think about everything she was leaving behind. She was on all those early morning shifts, mopping the same corridor, listening to the same sounds, year after year. All of that was in the music. You don't need to know anything about classical music to feel something like that. It reaches you before your brain has time to think about it. The retired music teacher on the judges' panel, a woman in her 60s who had heard thousands of performances in her lifetime, slowly lowered her reading glasses and set them on the table. She didn't write a single note on her scoring sheet. The radio presenter, who had been leaning back in his chair all evening with the casual ease of someone doing a job he'd done 100 times, was now sitting forward with his elbows on the table, his mouth slightly open. In the third row, a woman who had come with her husband and 2 children reached over and held her husband's arm without saying anything. She wasn't sure why. She would think about it later and still not be fully able to explain it. At the back of the hall, Blessing stood very still with both hands pressed over her mouth. Gerald, the coordinator, standing in the wings with his clipboard, had completely forgotten about the 3-minute rule. So Nadia played for just over 7 minutes. When the final note faded and her hands came to rest in her lap, nothing happened for a moment. Not a sound. 4 full seconds of complete silence. Then the hall came apart. The applause started somewhere in the middle of the audience and swept outward like a wave. People were standing up before they had consciously decided to. The judges were on their feet. Families who had been half distracted all evening were clapping with both hands above their heads. Someone near the back let out a long, involuntary cheer. Nadia opened her eyes. She looked out at the hall, as if she wasn't entirely sure where she was. Then, slowly, she stood up from the bench and gave a small, uncertain bow. And then, because she didn't quite know what else to do, she walked back off the stage. Backstage, she sat down on the same fold-out chair and cried. Not dramatically, just quietly, into the sleeve of her jumper, the way you do when something has been held in for a very long time, and suddenly there is no reason to hold it in anymore. Blessing found her a few minutes later. She didn't say anything clever or remarkable. She just sat down beside her and held her hand. One of the journalists who had come along expecting nothing filed a story that night. The headline was simple: Sheffield cleaner stuns community hall with world-class piano performance. Someone in the audience had filmed the last few minutes on their phone, slightly shaky, the audio not perfect. It didn't matter. The video went online that night. By the next morning, it had been shared over 14,000 times. By the end of the week, it had been watched by more than 2 million people. She had done nothing to seek any of this. She had only said yes to something that frightened her, on a rainy Tuesday night. Because someone reminded her of her mother, music schools reached out. A classical foundation offered funding. The Philharmonic Society in Sheffield invited her for a formal audition. Letters came from Poland. Her old academy in Krakow sent a message. Nadia took her time responding to all of it. She kept going to work at the hospital for several more weeks while she thought things through. Her colleagues, who had known her for years, were stunned. Not because they doubted her, but because they had simply never known. She had never said a word. When she finally did respond to the offers, she made choices that surprised some people. She accepted a part-time teaching role at a Sheffield music school. She began performing at small regional concerts and charity events. But she kept 2 hospital shifts a week. When a journalist asked her why, she said, "The piano teaches me how to feel. The hospital reminds me why feeling matters." Before every performance, she places a photograph on top of the piano, her mother's photograph. She does it herself, quietly, before anyone else arrives. She has done it every single time, without exception, since that October night in Sheffield. There is something worth sitting with in a story like this, not the viral numbers or the standing ovation or the offers that came pouring in afterward. Those things are remarkable, yes. But the real part of the story is the years before all of that. 5 years of early mornings and long shifts and a keyboard under the bed that barely got touched. 5 years of carrying something enormous and telling nobody. 5 years of grief that had no good place to go. And then one rainy Tuesday, a friend said the right thing at the right moment, and a woman, who had almost said no, walked out onto a stage in her everyday clothes and played like her life depended on it. Because in a quiet and private way, it did. The hall didn't know who she was when she sat down at that piano. They were barely paying attention, and that made what happened next all the more powerful. Because it was completely, utterly real. She wasn't trying to be discovered. She was just, finally, playing. Starden. True real-life story. Written in third person. For voiceover/YouTube script use.